Hello, I'm Ryan from Deque. Welcome to the Power and Perils of Empathy Accessibility Labs. I'm thrilled to have you here with us. I'm going to just cover a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. I'd like to remind everybody that this webinar is in fact being recorded. All registrants will receive an email probably sometime next week with that recording and the slides as well. If those of you are interested in captions, captions are already in the process of happening via Zoom. I've also pasted a stream text link into the chat box if that's your preferred method of adjusting captions. We have a pretty sweet shirt this year that says, "Digital equality is my jam," and I will be direct messaging in chat a handful of special attendees, and we'll be shipping within the US and Canada only one of these great shirts as a thank you for joining us live. And the last 15 to 20 minutes or so of our time scheduled together, we'll try to reserve for questions. At any point, you're welcome to submit those questions using the Q&A function in Zoom or directly in the chat. I think with that, we're ready to go. And Glenda, if you would kick us off, please.
You bet, Ryan. Thanks so much for hosting us, especially during this interesting time in the world. And welcome all of you to the Power and the Perils of Empathy Accessibility Labs. I have had the great pleasure of setting up an accessibility empathy lab for Deque, but more importantly, I've invited an amazing panel of people that also have that experience. So for the most part, I'm going to limit myself to being the moderator. I'm Glenda the Good Witch Sims, and I am the Director of Accessibility at Deque, and I'm happy to be your accessibility lab panel facilitator today. And I want to let each of the members of our panel introduce themselves and say your name and your major focus on accessibility in your organization and what organization that you work for. So let's do it in order that I have you on the slides. Joel, tell us about you. I think you're on mute, Joel. I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, you had that right. Thank you.
Perfect.
Getting used to Zoom, my first go around with Zoom. But first of all, I just want to thank you guys for making this a virtual panel. It's great that it could still go off with everything going on. My name is Joel Moffatt. I'm the Principal Product Manager and Customer Experience Lead for the accessibility team at Comcast. So one of the many things I do is to manage our Inclusive Experience Lab, which you can see virtually behind me. I'm actually at home right now, but that's our lab behind me. So I manage that lab. I work with our storytellers to create the messaging around that lab and the demos that go on there. I'm also the liaison from our Customer Experience Product team to our Customer Support team at our Accessibility Center of Excellence that handles all types of service and support for people with disabilities that we serve with our Xfinity product and Xfinity Mobile. And I also manage internal and external engagement for our team as well. And as my title would suggest, I also do product management, things like our accessible remote web application that's compatible with eye trackers like Tobii Dynavox iGauge products that was recently nominated to Time Magazine's Top 100 Inventions of 2019. So yeah, a lot of things that I do that all kind of point together in the same direction to create better experiences for our customers and for our employees.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. And Crystal, tell us a little bit about you.
All right. I'm chiming in from Dallas, Texas this afternoon. This is my 5th year with AT&T, and my titles bounce back and forth, but they're essentially the same thing. So I'm also a lead compliance analyst, as well as an accessibility solutions engineer. And that really doesn't tell you a whole lot. The main part of what I do for AT&T is I manage our Accessibility Awareness Lab. That's a big part of my job. But I also manage our advisory panel on access and aging. I plan out our annual GAD events and many, many other things. I'm also known as the PowerPoint accessibility guru. So I usually have just random ad hoc requests for remediating PowerPoints. Just fun stuff there. But the lab is the bulk of my job at AT&T.
Awesome. Well, we're pleased.
And you asked, Glenda, where we sit in our organization. I sit in our Chief Compliance Office, and I answer to our Chief Accessibility Officer.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here, Crystal. And you know how much I appreciate all your wisdom related to this topic. John, my brother at Deque, want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Glenda. My sister from a different mother, and hi, everybody else. The chair I sit in is in Georgetown, Texas, which is just north of Austin. My business card at Deque says Principal Accessibility Strategist. I've been working in the field of web accessibility for 2 decades now. I celebrated my 20th anniversary this month, as a matter of fact. And so I do a lot of things. At Deque, I'm currently the service owner for our empathy lab. So I basically take care of the logistics of getting our lab from location to location, as well as ensuring that it's staffed and whatnot. Other things that I do include instructor-led training, both virtual training as well as on-site training. I also spend a lot of time doing what can only be really considered sort of ad hoc consulting. Oftentimes I'll work with executive or senior level designers or developers when they're dealing with a particularly nuanced little thing that they're really trying to figure out and they can't get enough information out of WCAG. So I'll help them understand that. I guess the only other thing I'll add is, you know, and I think some people already know me, but I'm also very actively involved in the W3C around the work around many of the standards that we use, including not only the WCAG standard, but I'm also actively now involved in activities related to personalization as well as pronunciation task force. So that's where I get to go and geek out, and I love it.
I appreciate it very, very much too. Thank you, John. And Claudio, rounding up our panel, why don't you introduce yourself in this interesting week that's causing you extra work?
Yeah, that's an understatement. I'm dialing in from sunny Florida today, and I work with a major cruise line on the week of all weeks that you don't want to be working for a major cruise line. And my role is pretty much accessibility lead in pretty much anything that is digital. So I handle web accessibility. If anything, I would describe it almost like a candy store of all the different technologies that I work with, because I work with web, I work with the teams that develop native mobile applications, also work with the innovation lab that does like some really cool stuff like facial recognition that gets you on the ships in no time, work with architects and designers to build gateway stations, and also work with teams that build AR applications and kiosks. So it's kind of a fun sort of role where I get to work with all these different technologies and see what goes beyond the web. There's a lot of WCAG principles, you know, that pretty much apply to everything, even if it's AR experiences or stuff like performance objectives that you'll find in the CVAA that also are remarkably forward-looking. So my role in all of those is analyst, evangelist, raising awareness, compliance dude, you name it. You know, those are different roles that I have to play. And empathy figures into this as one of our sort of techniques for evangelizing, for getting people to really understand the needs of their audiences and really getting them to understand, you know, what our guests require and what sort of kind of scenarios our guests could find themselves into. But working with a cruise company, it's particularly interesting because you're working with this intersection of the physical world with the digital world. And so stuff that happens, in the physical world, like say having mobility issues, translates into how you handle the digital world in terms of how you organize your shore excursions and stuff. So there's definitely a back and forth that goes between the digital and the physical, for sure.
Well, I can't wait to talk to you more about AR later. But thank you all for being here in this interesting week and joining us virtually. And I think the next thing to talk about is each of us has some kind of an accessibility lab, an empathy lab, or an empathy experience. So Joel, why don't you kick us off with that? And meantime, audience, don't be shy about thinking up questions, because we want to answer your questions and not just be talking at the front of the room, all right? So be thinking about your questions. I'm setting a timer for 30 minutes, and I'm gonna ask you for those questions after that. So let's briefly describe our different lab experience, the what and the why. And Joel, I think you had the first lab out of the group of us, so you get to go first.
Okay, all right, thank you for that, I appreciate that. So yeah, our accessibility lab for the Comcast accessibility team, we opened the lab up back in October of 2013. So actually I started at Comcast in January of that year. And the first meetings that I sat on were with the architects to decide what that lab should really be, what function it should really serve. And what we arrived at was a space that should be a comfortable space where you could get the feeling of being in a living room, because as many of you in the room likely know, Comcast is, in the past has been viewed as a cable provider. Of course, we do video entertainment, but we also do home security and control, high-speed data, which is our biggest bucket right now, and all the service and support that wraps around all of that. So basically, we wanted to have a space where we could kind of emulate a living room, do some testing in a kind of a real environment. We wanted a place where you can get hands-on with different assistive technologies, not just with our products, but with things that we know that people use every day at home, whether it's a screen reader or whether it's a power wheelchair or a switch control. All the things that we know that people use in the assistive technology realm to connect with our products. We want to be able to demonstrate those. So that was one thing. We use the space really as a showcase, sometimes as a working lab, but often it's to evangelize, as that word has come up already on the panel here. So one of the main things is that all of our new hires who onboard at our headquarters here in Philadelphia come through the lab for at least 20 minutes as part of their onboarding day. So they really get a sense of accessibility and the company's commitment to it, because it's included right up front. And we've seen that pay off really well, because, it might not be on day one, it might not be on week one or month one, but at some point down the road, somebody always comes back and says, oh, I was in this lab during onboarding. So they have this kind of entree to it right up front, which has been really helpful. So we'll do usability reviews in the lab in addition to those new hire tours. Sometimes we'll have students come in, sometimes grade school students, which is actually a lot of fun. So there's a lot of different activities we can do with them in addition to just showing the products, and a lot of ways that we can kind of catalyze understanding even among our executives, or whether it's external partners. A big part of what I do as a customer experience lead for the team is to connect with external partners, community thought leaders, whether they're in the advocacy space or the realm of research or the realm of innovation. We want to connect with people who are connected with people with disabilities, so that we can help drive innovation and drive understanding of where our products need to go next. Because I don't have to tell anybody here in the virtual room on this panel or otherwise that you can't develop accessibility in a vacuum. You really need to get with the customer, the people who are going to benefit from the solutions you're going to offer. And the lab has really helped us do that, to have a space where you can get hands-on with the technology. You can actually bring people in, because for a short time, after I started, when we were spinning up the team, we really didn't have that. And it was like night and day once we did have a space where you could convey what accessibility was, why it's important, and not just in the context of our products, but in the context of all products.
And one of the reasons that we have such a diverse panel up here is that some of you may be looking at this room that Joel has and the equipment in it and thinking, I am not going to get the budget for that this week or this month or this year. And so let Crystal tell you about a different version of a lab that she calls, I believe, the AT&T Mobile Accessibility Lab. So Crystal, over to you.
Thank you, Glenda. So what we were seeing at AT&T 2-3 years ago was mainly with the designers and the developers seeing accessibility as a roadblock, or that they'd get bottlenecked in the design process there, and they just weren't getting it. So when we pitched the idea to our directors of, hey, Comcast has this awesome lab, Yahoo, had this awesome lab, like Google, Facebook, we need a lab like that so that we can help build empathy in these designers and developers so that they get it, so that it's not just a requirement to them anymore, it's more meaningful. And what we got back was, that's great, but we're a global company, and it doesn't make sense for us to fly in everyone to headquarters to experience this lab. So if you can make it mobile, we'll give you funding to create one. And that task was given to me, is to try to figure out how to create an empathy lab and make it mobile. So that's what I did. We ship our lab around to any AT&T location. We're starting to dabble in international now. We've taken it to Mexico City, so that's been real exciting. And I'm sure everyone on this panel is in the same boat. You have to quantify the work you do for your employer. One of the ways I quantify the lab is to keep track of how many attendees, how many cities I'm going to, how many showcases is set up. So you'll see the first bullet point is tip of the week. That is a real short and sweet, like a tweet, real short and sweet one-liner that's sent out every Monday morning to a distribution list. So we have a simple SurveyMonkey sign up, and that is the first station when you come to my lab, is you sign up to receive that accessibility tip of the week. Because we all know that you don't learn this stuff in a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's constantly changing as technology changes. And so that helps keep us in these people's pockets every Monday morning, a slight reminder of, hey, we're still here. We can still answer your questions and help you on the road. Life hacks is another very important one that I created. I was doing a demonstration for our DirecTV talking set-top box to one of the high-level directors, and when we were done, he was like, this is really great, this is awesome, but what's the point? Because blind people wouldn't be watching TV. And I thought, oh my gosh, this guy doesn't get it. And if you're stuck in that mindset, and maybe you don't have a personal connection to someone with a disability, and you're stuck in that area of thinking people with disabilities don't work and they're just sitting at home and not doing anything, you're not going to understand the assistive technology that I have to show you. We need to bring it down a level. So Life Hacks is low tech, no tech information. It's trying to get you past that hurdle to understand that this is how they're feeding themselves. This is how the blind are watching TV. This is how the deaf are listening to music, and it gets you past the hurdle. And then the other ones are very similar to everyone else on this panel: cognitive, blind, low vision, speech, deaf and hard of hearing, motor control, as well as gaming, because we bought Warner Media 2 years ago, so we included gaming. And that's another thing we try to do at least once a year, is to keep the lab fresh. So I'll rotate a station out, rotate something else in, maybe combine two things that weren't combined before. And we try to just change it up a little bit. And that has actually occurred. I have had people come visit the lab a second year, and that's the first thing they ask is, so what's new, what's different? So There's
I
ours in a
can't wait
nutshell.
to come see your new things. And I love the questions piling up. Keep them coming. I'm going to let each of these people describe their labs before we take any questions, but keep them coming. They're wonderful. So Crystal inspired me and my executive team to build an empathy lab, and John is the owner of that empathy lab now. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the Deque one, John?
Sure can. And I wanted to add that for those of you that see me here today without a cowboy hat, circle the calendar because that's really rare. I'm always in my cowboy hat, as a matter of fact. For those of you that are seeing the deck, that's me up there in the top left-hand corner. So as Glenda mentioned, Deque's Empathy Lab is patterned very much along some of the stuff that Crystal was doing, and really did inspire the flavor of our Empathy Lab, because I think all of us have similar yet slightly different offerings. Some of the really critical things for ours, and I guess maybe one of the things that's kind of makes our lab stand apart, is that unlike my other colleagues on the panel, where they are talking to fellow employees for the most part, Deque's Empathy Lab is really a man-in-the-middle kind of thing, where we will be delivering an empathy lab to our clients. And so oftentimes it's, you know, at the request of the client, or it's a part of a much larger program that we're selling into our clients as they're trying to come to grips with accessibility. And so, I mean, we have many of the similar kinds of activities that Crystal has in her lab, and probably a lot of what Joel has as well. Ours is very much sort of activity driven. We even use a passport metaphor because our goal is to get people through the lab in a reasonable amount of time. About 25 minutes seems to be about the right number, give or take. And so, like a lot of the labs, they're very experiential. One of the things that I feel is really, really critical is that the labs are fun. And I know we're going to be talking about sort of the difference between empathy versus sympathy, but I think that keeping that sense of youthful delight, right? I liken our lab to taking kids to the science museum, where the kids are all running around touching and doing and stuff like that, and all the parents are sitting there going, yeah, and you're learning stuff, right? The kids are having fun, but they're learning through doing that. So, you know, one of the things that, not super unique, but one of the things that we also have is that our lab is extremely hardened for travel. Crystal mentioned expanding into Mexico. We just had our first empathy lab in Europe last week. It did have some hiccups, which we're going to be sitting down and sort of triaging afterwards. But we currently have 2 mobile labs based in North America that travel around the country, and we're even looking to travel into other countries in North America. We also have a 3rd lab located in our office in India, which is now starting to go out to companies and organizations in that part of the world as part of our sort of larger global reach to work with our clients. So yeah, that's our lab, and it's been really, really well received. The one last thing I'll add is that, as I said, we see this as being used as a part of a larger sort of activity that we'll undertake with our clients. And one of the things that's proven to be really, really effective is we also have a number of instructor-led training opportunities, or after this week, we're starting to migrate to virtual-led training activities. But when those training activities where we would go on site and do 2 or 3 days of training, we found that starting or kicking off that training activity with the Empathy Lab really was really great fertilizer for the rest of the training, right? Like, now that you've experienced or had an insight into some of these things, let's talk about how we're going to solve it as we're doing our development practices or our design practices or whatnot. So it really does keep everything really fresh in the mind of the people in the class, because they've had an opportunity to actually do some touching and experiencing, and now we're going to talk about it.
And then we have the wipes and the Peril to clean it.
And we have the wipes and the Perils, yes.
which Crystal told me to do even before this virus, because yeah, she's visionary. So far, what you've seen are labs where we've each been given a budget and we were allowed to go buy things. And then we met Claudio, and Claudio, he's got this really cool vision. So tell us about your thoughts on this.
So it's a little bit different. And I've been looking into chat, and I see some people going like, hey, what do you do if you have like a budget of next to zero? Well, I can tell you what you can do if you have a lot of personality and a budget of next to zero is, what we do is we have like small, more intimate sort of sessions, which is why we don't have a photograph of them, where we get like about 10 to 15 people in a circle. So picture this almost as like going to a meeting, and somebody, the first thing we'll do is we'll set it up as a safe place where we set it up where anything can be said in this room and there's no question that's wrong or inappropriate. And, if, as you know, people who are new to disability or new to accessibility have like this total discomfort and this fear. So a lot of it is just kind of setting the stage where this is a safe space where you can ask anything. And then the way we work these labs is that we will have simulation sessions, and, we will like let people try out a wheelchair or try out goggles with like Vaseline on them, or use, barbecue mitts to type with, like silicone barbecue mitts, that sort of thing. So we'll do those sort of simulation exercises, but we'll use them kind of as bumpers in between like the heavier sort of, let's talk about how real this is to be a wheelchair user, or, what is it like to go through your everyday routine as a blind person? What is it like to go dating as a blind person? So in these sessions, it's kind of like, how can I describe it? It's like going to a jazz club and hearing a really good ballad. There's a moment like 3 notes in where all of a sudden everything gets real and it gets larger than life. And like, you can just feel this collective breath in the room. That's kind of how I would describe the sessions. And, there's a moment of almost like timelessness where people are really connecting on a very personal sort of level to talk about disabilities and, to talk about, what it takes to get through the day. And I would say it's incredibly effective, from an evangelist point of view. Like, you see these sort of conversion moments happen. You see these light bulbs going off. You see people going like, oh my God, I never looked at the world this way. And so in that sense, it's less about, it's certainly the opposite extreme from going to the science museum and just playing around and you're kind of like learning while you play. This is, much more intentional. It's much, much deeper, more sincere sort of experience. But then again, the numbers are different. When we were prepping for this talk, we were talking about like how many people you could handle. And, you guys who have the actual labs that go different places, you could handle an entire cafeteria full of people at lunch hour. I could never hope for that. So I would say this is ideal, particularly if you're like trying to work with a design team or you're trying to work with a product team and a small, very empowered team. It really works, and you can do these exercises on a pretty small budget. I think the hardest challenge for me is getting somebody with a disability to that event, finding somebody who's willing to open up like that, and finding somebody who's comfortable, being asked those sorts of questions. Like that for me is like the larger challenge.
And as we're headed this direction, I love the questions that I'm seeing coming up. There have been some questions about questioning trying on a disability, and certainly we don't want people to walk away with a feeling of, oh my gosh, how sad, because really that is not what this is about. And so I think this is the peril of or the danger of these if it's not handled correctly. And so one of the things that Crystal shared with me when she was doing her research and setting up her lab was the word empathy is often misunderstood. And I don't think I really understood it before I sat down and talked to Crystal about it. You know, I would have probably thought empathy and sympathy and pity were somewhat interchangeable. They're not. Pity is the last thing we want to create. And so in designing a situation like this, if your experiences are creating, oh man, that's bad, I don't ever want to be like that, your experience is not going to move the needle in the right direction. Sympathy is also not the dynamic we are going for. Sympathy is a, oh, you poor thing. And it is not until we get to empathy, and there's a video that I'm going to link to at the end. I'm not going to play it right now, but Utah from Canada talks about that empathy is when you actually begin to get some sort of understanding and you care, you value the diversity and the opportunity, and you want to solve the problem. And so there's something curious about this empathy word. It can be like a red flag to some people. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask the panel is simply, do you use the word empathy in your accessibility lab? Do you even describe your lab as an empathy experience? Or is there a reason you avoid it? So Joel, how about you? Do you highlight that word, or does it just come up here or there?
Well, I mean, to your point about the word often being misunderstood, it's, I don't feel really you need to lean on the word, so it doesn't really come up in our lab. As I listen to your points about it, though, I think if we were to use it, I would use it as a teaching moment to explain the misconceptions about the word, right? So we talk about inclusive experience a lot. And for us, a lot of times we're bringing in an internal group that's either really interested in the topic because they've heard about our group and what we've done with our products, or maybe it's new hires, or maybe it's another group that's pretty new to accessibility. So, you know, often it's me giving a tour, or somebody else on our team, potentially a person with a disability. So I usually lead in by talking about different types of disabilities. You know, you've got sensory, you've got cognitive, you've got physical, and so on. But you also have different groups of people who are going to either self-identify as having a disability versus those who don't. And I think we know among the aging population, you have a lot of people that don't self-identify, right? And then you have people with a hidden disability. Like joining me on a webinar right now, you wouldn't know that I have Usher syndrome and very narrow vision, and that I use a white cane every day. And people at work might not know that if they approach me at my desk and don't see the cane. But when I'm in the lab, I have the cane out, and I don't really mind talking about my disability as a part of a culture that I'm a part of my job. But also not the only thing that defines me, but I don't mind that it's part of the definition of me. So, I mean, sometimes I'll even have somebody come into the lab and open up with, you know, a joke about my disability because they're clearly uncomfortable, and that's what people do. And, you know, usually it's like a daredevil joke because I also have hearing aids, which is, oh, all right, fair enough. I get it, but pretty not cool, but I kind of shrug it off. And then after that bit at the beginning, you can see that person gets pretty quiet, and maybe they're learning, maybe they're not, but I think we give them a good context to learn because we're not afraid to like approach different ideas about disability and acknowledge that for people in the room, you might not have the context, and that's okay.
And like Claudio said, it's a safe space to explore that and to learn. So I'm gonna flip to Crystal, because when Crystal first showed me her lab and her recipe for how to create the lab, which she kindly shares, I'm pretty sure you were using the word empathy in it, and that now you're not. Am I remembering that correctly?
Sort of. So I spent several weeks doing research first before I kind of came up with a formalized plan for this is what I'd like to buy and how it's going to look and the exercises and whatnot. And it was in that prep research that I found that just the word empathy had such a negative connotation to it in the field, and it was frowned upon. I just did not have a positive feeling for it in any of the blog articles, any of the research papers, everything I was reading, just, it wasn't positive. So what I did was I went back to my team of volunteers and I said, look, we got to call this thing something else. It's not going to take the traction I think it should as quickly as it should if we call it empathy. So we had several ideas. We took a team vote and we landed on Accessibility Awareness Lab. But accessibility, I think that has more, it covers more. It describes better about what the lab is really about. Empathy is still quite the buzzword in the design and user experience area. So I hear that a lot too, but I think accessibility actually says more about it. And more specifically, I wanted to jump up and down and raise my hand to answer this one, Glenda, but specifically the comment about, making sure you're not trying on a disability. In the research I did in planning this out, I discovered that with adult learners, specifically, you have to follow up with the why. And that's what makes the difference between a bad experience and a good experience. Tell them why you're telling them to code something a certain way. Tell them why they have to follow WCAG a certain way. Tell them why they have to test it. They got to know the why part. And that's the key component to teaching adults.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I love the word empathy, so I had it emblazoned all across our lab, and I've noticed that our marketing team or John or somebody has added Accessibility Lab in there. John, where are you on this?
Well, where I am is starting with the actual definition of the word empathy, which is the capacity to understand or feel what another being is experiencing from within their frame of reference. That is the capacity to place oneself in another's position, right? And so that really is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get people to think bigger, to think outside the box. And I can appreciate that done wrong, right? It can easily devolve into sympathy, which again is why I really lean real hard into this notion of having fun. Because you can't be sympathizing with sympathy. Also has a connotation of being sad, right? And I don't want people to be sad. I want them to be excited by the possibilities. One of the things that we do, and I've tried a couple of different ways, as we host these things. One of the things that I found has been really, really effective is one of our stations is an opportunity. As I said, we work with this passport metaphor. And one of the stations allows you to go and braille your name on your passport, which is just a real touch, do arts and crafts kind of activity. You don't feel sorry about it, but you start to think about, oh yeah, this is a little bit complex. But then what I do is I encourage people, okay, after you've brailled your name, we have one of our stations is called our Accessibility Stories station, which is normally manned by someone who has a disability, and oftentimes in our organization that person is visually impaired, and I'll say, after you brailled your name, go and talk to Mark or Janine or somebody and have them read the braille and check your name. And so it's fun, it's exciting. Oh, I'm going to go do that. That sounds like an interesting thing to do. And so you don't give people an opportunity to just dwell on the negative. You make it fun. It's exciting. We have another one that is our Cognitive Disabilities Challenge, where it gathers a large group of people around the table as the one person is sort of experiencing the challenge of tracing a star while looking in a mirror, and how awkward that is. And nobody does that in real life. So it doesn't even open itself up to sympathy, but what it does do is it opens up the avenue to have a deeper conversation about what does it mean to be cognitive disabled? It has nothing to do with intelligence, but rather just like you trying to trace a star in the mirror, one or more of the wires in your brain is perhaps crossed, right? So it's about taking these experiences and leveraging them as educational opportunities. You just don't throw them into the lab and say, run and play. You have to facilitate it and guide them through the teachable moments.
And I'm looking at our time, and we've got about 2 minutes and 26 seconds until we're at the 30-minute mark, and we wanted to start taking questions. So, Claudio, I'm going to let you answer that empathy question later, and I want to start with what's one thing you wish you knew before you set up your labs? What's a mistake that you could prevent somebody else from making? And Crystal, I would like to start with you. Do you have something in mind?
I do. But you reminded me of the Purell wipes, and that was definitely, I learned that on the very first showcase, that you're going to have a germaphobe in every crowd, and that's okay. We love our germaphobes. But the real lesson I wish I had known first, I attempted to fly with my cases once because I was paired up with a team that was trying to do Chicago one day and then flight that night to St. Louis the next day. And so I was trying to take my lab cases on the plane, you know, as luggage and whatnot. And that was just an epic failure. Always ship, just always ship it. They didn't put it, they didn't put my, they didn't put my cases on the oversized conveyor belt. They shoved it on the carousels with normal luggage. It was upside down when it was on that carousel. And here I am trying to lug this 100-pound case off of that thing. It was nuts. It was just nuts.
Joel, is there one thing you wish you knew before you set up your lab in Philly?
Probably several things, but yeah, I think the challenges of how to the different demos that we had and to have that flow make sense for the people coming through, and also kind of the level of effort it takes to maintain the technology that you have in the lab. I mean, we all know that technology moves very quickly. When you're dependent on that technology for demo purposes, it seems to move even more quickly, and your equipment is outdated before you know it. So just the process of getting in there and manning these tours and, you know, realizing what is the default configuration of the lab that I need it in. Now, fortunately, we've now moved to the Comcast Technology Center, our new building right in the center of downtown Philadelphia. And we've got a huge Comcast Labs space on our 20th floor. And our accessibility lab is a piece of that. That room is staffed with what we call storytellers who don't necessarily come from the accessibility realm, but they're really good and passionate about technology and the possibilities for technology. So they do a really nice job, even when we can't be there for a tour, doing the kind of basic stuff and making sure we're all set up to go when we get in there. So that definitely is a luxury. But when I was doing most of it, it really was quite a lift to make sure that the lab was properly calibrated every morning, and then go back to my desk and do my day job. So
yeah, it's a lot of work. Ryan, how much more time do we have?
We have about 16 minutes.
About 60 minutes? Okay, good. Let me go ahead and Claudio, is there anything that you wish you knew before you set up your experiences?
I would say that for those times when we haven't done it inside the company and when we've done it, like say at a UX conference, that sort of thing, is just how difficult transportation can be if you're trying to get a guest with a disability to your event. And for those of you that are corporate world and those of you who sponsor events, please, please, please consider sponsoring Uber vouchers for panelists or any sort of transportation for people who have a disability who cannot drive to get to the conference, because you'll so eliminate, you know, a huge hurdle or a huge barrier to people with disabilities being able to represent themselves at events.
Yeah, yeah, and we've paid a lot of times, as John mentioned, we have the good fortune of having excellent accessibility experts who happen to have a disability, and they're our employees, so we send them. But when they're not available, we've paid people. Lucy Greco, Chancey Fleet have worked in our labs. We paid their transportation and we paid for their time because they were being professionals. John, is there a tip about something you wish you knew that you would want to save other people from doing?
And mine might be somewhat specific to the way that we use the lab at Deque, where we're constantly shipping it to a client location. And so right now our lab packs into a padded Pelican case, shipping case. But even though the case itself is padded and is intended to ship, the gear that goes inside the case don't cheap out. And in our first iteration, we used a lot of plastic containers, and we had plastic signage and whatnot. And it's just that kind of stuff doesn't take the bump and grind of being on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, if you're going to get containers, get soft plastic, like Tupperware style containers, that will take a little bit of shock and not shatter into a million pieces. You know, use metal signs over plastic signs if you can. And be really careful when you're shopping for specific pieces of equipment. Probably the most fragile piece of equipment we have on the road is our 2-paddle switch, just the orange and white square switches.
And Crystal's has never broken, but both of ours broke. So
right,
I'm like,
and so I mean, the thing is that I need to investigate what the problem is there, but as a piece of technology, it seems that that particular piece is a little more fragile than, say, for example, the styluses and Diane stylus for the brailing exercise. So thinking about kind of really kind of rugged, you know, Yeti style kind of gear that goes out to your mobile lab, spend the extra money because you'll only spend it once instead of spending it twice.
yeah. True, true. Well, I could talk all day about this, and we have a queue of about 10 questions. Oh, hi, Jen. I didn't know you were here. And it is time for your turn, so I'm going to move to questions, but I'm also going to flip real quick to a slide that I have, because I noticed a question, I think it was from Jay Wyant, about he wants a shopping list. And I don't know, Crystal, were you able to put your shopping list up on Claudio's Empathy Wiki yet?
No, I was not, but I will.
Okay, either that or Jay Wyant's looking for your shopping list. So I did wanted to mention that Claudio started a wonderful wiki out on GitHub. Both Crystal and I contributed to it, and there's some really valuable things out there that are, if I remember correctly, Claudio, the inspiration behind this wiki was when you don't have the big budget, right?
Right. I mean, and the kind of use case I was aiming at, because it's funny that we saw the questions from India, was like, my thinking was like, how do you do this in India with a shoestring budget without being able to, like, you know, get high-tech stuff necessarily from Amazon in the U.S.? So that was the thinking, like, okay, don't let that be a barrier to someone being able to do, you know, really good exercises.
Or you just go to Hyderabad and check out our empathy lab, or we ship it around India. Because we're
I'm
game.
there.
Because we're absolutely game. All right. So there've been some fabulous questions. Let me come back to. So where in the life cycle of an accessibility program does it make the most sense to start an accessibility lab? Thoughts, panel, on that? I'm like,
is this, you want to set up a lab in your organization, or when would it be good to expose your organization to something like an empathy lab?
I don't know. My opinion is setting one up is probably not going to be at the front end, but exposure to it could happen at any point along it. And when I remember the one that we did in New York for a financial, watching those high-level director and above execs get it leads to funding.
Yeah.
So developers and designers, it's easy to understand, wow, we understand why we're designing. But then when the execs want to fund it,
I would, so to that question, in the life cycle, the sooner the better. I mentioned that at DQ, we find that starting off a training week by having the empathy lab first and then going into the classroom for the training is a really powerful 1-2 punch, because they've experienced it. Now let's go talk about it, and how do we address that user experience, and how do we overcome some of those things?
Question, has anybody figured out metrics to determine how well a lab worked? This question is from Steve. Because we think they're successful. Why do we think they're successful?
I'll jump in, Glenda. I don't know if you could consider it metrics, and they may be one-offs, but there have been occasions where I usually demonstrate, you know, in VDA and whatnot on our own att.com website. And there have been occasions where I've had a person sit down and do that exercise and ask me, I manage this other page that comes off of att.com. How do I test my page? How do I know if my page has the same experience? And then we have a bigger conversation. So I've had golden nuggets like that, especially when I get designers in and they have that aha moment and they sit there and talk to me about it a little bit more. You know, while I can't necessarily put a number to that, it's happening over and over again. And another thing I see that we tend to do, and I'm sorry, somebody said my mic was really loud, and I'm a loud talker, so I will try to be softer. What I've noticed is that people put each other in bubbles, right? So if I see a coworker at the grocery store, I might blank on your name for a few seconds because you're not in the work office like you're supposed to be, you know, and we tend to put people in bubbles. So I'll have people come through and have that moment of, oh, you're talking about my child. You're talking about my mom. And they're not necessarily seeing them as a customer until they come through the lab. So I get that experience as well. And I get a lot of parents that have their aha moment too, especially with the cognitive exercise of finally getting it. Like, this is what my kid has been going through, and having those moments. So I know they're there. I know it's working. I know people request me to come back several times. I just don't necessarily have a number or a percentage that I can add to it.
We've had an interesting experience with a large financial company that's based, has a headquarter in New York, and they're bringing us back again and again, rolling us out to their different units. And what we're seeing is, it reminds me where we're not just teaching people, but we're actually getting into their hearts and minds. So it's no longer a motivation of, you have to do this because you're told. You're actually doing it because you care. You're doing it because you understand. If you didn't understand that a person who's blind can use an iPhone, but then you watched one of our experts do it at the accessibility stories table at faster than you, it's like, oh, I get it. This really makes a lot of sense. A question from Karen. How do you come up with your ideas for the activities? Is this your own creativity? I came up with a lot of my ideas from Crystal.
And I use the power of Google. No, seriously though, I had about 12 volunteers. They all work in our compliance department. They all worked on accessibility, but it was volunteer to help me. And so I would have people, you know, I'd point them to certain things. So I had Jill Piner on our team. Her background was in psychology. I had her tasked with cognitive. I said, you go search the web, go search your books, whatever you got, and find me the best cognitive exercise that's out there right now. And so I crowdsourced it, if you will. But a lot of our findings came through the power of Google, just simple searches and trying different terminologies to get to what we needed.
John, an interesting question came in the chat from Aaron. Did Janine and Mark feel awkward about sitting around reading names like a party trick at these events?
They don't, in part, and actually, that whole kind of interaction was something that Mark and I cooked up together. So it's all about approach. And when I encourage people to go over and talk to Mark, yeah, it may look on the surface like it's a party trick, right? But what it's also doing is it's giving people an opportunity and a reason to go talk to a blind person. And I find a lot of people that come through the Empathy Lab, in their own personal life experience, they've never spoken to somebody who has a disability. They don't know how to talk to somebody with a disability. And so, yeah, the first thing is, hey, did I spell my name right in Braille? But you see, they've initiated a conversation. And now all of a sudden they're sitting down or they're standing there and they're talking to a blind person very matter-of-factly. And it really, it's about making it an approachable thing. So, yeah, there might be a little bit of entertainment factor there, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I believe in entertainment factor to a certain extent. I talked about this idea of fun, right? And one of the metrics I use is that when the room is really buzzing and you can hear and feel the energy in the room, you know you're succeeding, right? I mean, because the energy is there. And so it's not about, oh, go, now that you've done Braille, go see the trained dog and who reads Braille. It's not that at all. It's about go and talk to somebody with a disability. And what happens is that once they say, oh, yeah, oh, you spelt it wrong, and a little bit of explanation, and not everybody reads Braille. And so my experts take that as a launching point to start having a conversation and having people start thinking much deeper, more broadly about all the disability types and all the accessibility concerns that we're looking at. So it's a mechanism, it's not an outcome.
And one of my rules for whoever's sitting at the accessibility stories table, they have to be friendly, outgoing, they have to be smart as curse word, so that that interaction is not going to have the feeling of the person walking away from the table of pity or sympathy, but actually awe.
Yeah.
And yeah. Chancey Fleet knocked it out of the park when we were in New York.
Every time we've had a blind person sit at that table, I mean, we've got 3 or 4 people internally at Deque that have done that. We've hired people as well. And so I'm mindful of that. We don't want it to turn it into a pity party. My experience and observations telling me that we're succeeding at that. It's not that at all. It's wow, that was really interesting. What also is really cool is that people will go over and talk to Mark or Janine, and they'll start talking about blindness as a disability, and then all of a sudden the conversation will go off into a, well, I have a family member, so, and the people find that they've also now got a kindred spirit, which is also a really interesting phenomenon that I never expected to see, but I've seen it, that people walking out of the lab going, now I feel more empowered to talk about disability. I've known about this internally, and I've never known how to bring it up in my organization. I feel better about it now.